So let's start tonight with a round of applause to Rayan, the audio engineer. He deserves it. A very talented audio expert. He'll also be passing mics during the Q&A. And I noticed there's a lot of people that are far away. If you'd like to get closer, feel free. You don't feel like it? You get to get very close and intimate with this gentleman here, Lorenzo Trombetta. A round of applause for Lorenzo, please. This podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners and viewers like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box. Any amount is appreciated. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The handle, the Beirut Banyan. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. And to stay updated with video releases, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for listening, and thanks for watching. I'm Rani Shatar, and this is the Beirut Banyan. I'll start with the personal, and then we'll get into the political. I think it was maybe the second or third week of October last year. I was at a amateur stand-up comedy routine in Hamra at Barzakh, one of the audience members. And then the person sitting next to me nudged me and said, "Lorenzo's behind you." I'm like, "Who's Lorenzo?" And I turn, and it's this gentleman on his laptop working hard. You came up to me, I think, during the break and introduced yourself. But when I was looking at you, you looked very familiar. And I couldn't place you. And then it occurred to me it's because it's been 20 years since I probably last saw you here in Gemmaise. 20 years ago, you had a Vespa. Okay, I have one now. I think we're taking the same route. I'm trying to connect the puzzle, put the pieces together. It may have been at Torino when Torino first opened. Maybe, which is exactly why we don't remember each other. Torino is one of the first bars to open in Gemmaise, and I think when we were younger, we're probably more reckless with ourselves. And then it occurred to me that's 20 years ago. 20 years ago, and time flies in this country. And 2 decades later, you're saying hello. Thankfully, you're here just for 6 days. We managed to do this on a Tuesday, which is not usual for the podcast, which is why it's great to have a full house, an unexpected full house tonight. I have to admit, because I don't read Italian or speak Italian, except for those lines that you heard earlier, I've gotten to know your work 2 ways, either through translation or really catching you, unfortunately, in my opinion, on social media more than usual. But I think I'm able to better understand your perspectives thanks to that, and a lot of fans of yours that are in this country that are very excited that I'm doing this. Now, let's go back in time, 20 years ago, just for the very basic knowledge. What brought you to Beirut back then, and what really set off what I think is a remarkable career in both journalism and research, because you're a published author as well, in addition to being an academic. So let's go back in time. What brought you to Beirut?
You, first of all, Ronnie, I'm very honored to be here with you. I should admit that I'm a little bit nervous because perhaps it's one of the first times in my Beirut life, after 2 decades, I can share with you and with this audience on the sidewalk my perspective, my also past experience, because I do not longer live in Beirut as I did since the early 2000s. Coming to Beirut is also always an emotional moment of my personal path. Even today, now walking down here, every new shop, new bar, new restaurant that open in Amra remembers me something linked to my personal story, and the Vespa is one of these aspects. So, try to answer your first question. back in the 90s, when I was at secondary school, I was overwhelmed by, at the time, political debate and public debate on the new comers, migrants coming from Northern Africa to Italy, mainly Egyptian, Algerian, Tunisians. And I was born and I was raised and I was living in a big city, Rome, where effectively these newcomers, as at the time where they were considered, were increasingly present around me. Reading newspapers mainly, not social media. At the time we didn't have smartphones. So this Arabic language was blossoming around me. The same time, the Gulf War, the second Gulf War, 1991, again, was a critical moment in my life at school, because for the first time I was actively involved in shaping the school public debate on what is this war is about. So again, the Middle East, the Arabic language was so surrounding me. And I wanted to understand at the time, who are these people who are described so far from us, but actually, geographically speaking, are very close to me. So I decided to start studying Arabic. And then by many coincidences, I got the chance to choose Arabic studies at universities instead of law or medicine or the classical usual disciplines after Italian secondary school we can choose. And then I went to Damascus for a scholarship, 98. Now, I won't enter into many details. We can go back later if you want. But being in Damascus and then in Amman, in Jordan, the year after, witnessing also the death of King Hussein in Amman, going back to Damascus 2000, and then catching the last plane from Damascus airport to Rome on September 11. The very exact date of September 11, I took the last plane from Damascus, because then for a few hours Damascus airport was shut down for security reasons, globally, I think. And in between, I visited Beirut only for a few days, coming from Damascus or from Amman, from another world. Because at that time, late 90s, Damascus and Beirut were far more than now, perhaps, two different realities. So Beirut inspired me, told me something. Later on, I'm arriving at the end of 10 years time story. I was in Paris starting my PhD at Sorbonne, and I was following with some Lebanese friends in Paris, snowing, and then autumn 2004, the culmination of the Lebanese-Syrian crisis with the resolution 1559, the first assassination attempt to Marwan Hamadeh, and the very same day, the suicide or the killing of Ghazi Kanan in Damascus. So I thought that Syria and Lebanon again were part of my life, and I decided to come back here and to stay for almost forever, because I stayed here half of my life.
Yeah, I got to know your work more through Syria, and I think it's fair to say that on a wider scope, that's probably where your research is more focused too. And you have this duality. You're here to study, you're a scholar, but you're also a journalist. And I'd like to touch on journalism first before we get into the heavier subjects. Just your role as a correspondent over time. And I hope I remember this right, it's ANSA, ANSA, is that right?
Yeah.
And LiMes is the other one?
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Did this world of journalism come by accident simply because you're in this part of the world? Or is that something you were seeking back then? And I ask because the role of a correspondent has changed dramatically the last 20 years. I think back then it takes a lot more patience, to actually enter that sphere through traditional media. And you do it, and you've been doing it since then. So what took you to journalism?
Indeed, my dream was to become a journalist. Since I remember, 14, I was telling my parents, I really want to, at least to clean the desks of journalists. I want really to be in a newsroom and to breathe. Of course, now my journalist colleagues now can laugh, but at the time I was only 14, and I really liked the perfume of the ink of the paper, of the newspapers. So at the time I thought, okay, if I won't be a journalist, at least I would like to have a newspaper kiosks in order to be always in touch with newspapers. So I didn't become journalist by chance or through the Middle East.
Not to be superficial, but even the smell of ink is timed now. You don't do that anymore. So it's nice to hear you date yourself.
Yeah, my white hairs can give a testimony of this. I don't know, my daily life, my daily work routine in Beirut, even until 2017, 2018, was to pass 1 hour reading newspaper, reading traditional reading. I mean, not scrolling my fingers on a screen, but really walking through pages, tangible pages. That's something that it's I don't do anymore, unfortunately. But going back to the reason why I start to embark on this media career, I feel the urge since I was in school to be a medium, to be a tool of passing, if not knowledge, how a fact can be told from A to B, from the so-called source or the so-called event to an audience. Of course, now I'm talking retrospectively, analyzing this. At the time, I didn't know all these details of myself, but so that was the urge. And I coupled with a passion for a country and for a region that really needed to be, the story of this region need to be told in a different way, or at least that was my urge again. The political debate and the public debate in Italy at the time, even in Europe, in the West overall, because I'm coming from the western side of the Mediterranean, I felt that we need to address, to counterbalance a narrative that at the time I felt really toxic or misleading, especially after I visited Damascus, Amman, Beirut a little bit. When I went back to Italy, even the academic allies, in the university allies, I felt alienated by how, both from media and the academic debate, they were looking at these realities. So journalism is a tool to try to improve. But I don't know how much time I have for each answer. I don't want to...
You have all the time in the world.
Okay, so something that I discovered later on, working here in Beirut mainly, I felt the trap of working for a counter-narrative.
Okay. Can I just ask, is this mostly, in your experience, post-2003 with the second Gulf War, or is this before? Because I'm trying to date your, if it can be said, almost the way you see narrative shaping and the way you're covering this region. Is it, or maybe better, is it pre-September 11 or post-September 11 that you find that mission to be the counter narrative? Because I know you're... Sorry, yeah, please.
No, there was a sedimentation, an overlap, an accumulation of anecdotes and moments, mentioning how migrants from Northern Africa were described in Italy. So before 9/11.
So it's more Italian focused.
Yeah.
And then you already come with that perspective.
Yeah, because at the time my life experience was really confined to Italy.
Right.
But later on, of course, 9 September, 11 September was another milestone, 2003, and then many others. But what I understood, at least from my perspective, the narrative the discourse is a tool. Is a tool that could be used to manipulate people. It's not only a neutral tool that naively, as I was thinking in a naive way, I would like to tell a fact to an audience. Being a medium, of course, I'm adjusting, I'm selecting, I'm excluding, including, I'm affecting the narrative in a very simple way. But imagining a complex political system where I'm not Lorenzo, the independent freelancer, able to shape the narratives. I'm only a small piece of a puzzle where everything is stronger than me in shaping, in crafting how things are told. So if I start conceiving the narratives as a tool, even the counter narrative I was trying to push for was not the right idea. I mean, if everything is saying that, let's say, Lebanon is a country characterized by sectarianism, and my mission is to explain to outside audience that no, there are other factors in order to explain political dynamics in Lebanon, I should not forget that sectarianism is a part of the dynamic. But sometimes, and many other peer colleagues and even academics are working so hard in order to counterbalance the narrative that are becoming more loyalists. They are becoming fanatics as the other narrative supports. So we need to find a balance in between, and I found that balance, at least from my experience, in conceiving the narrative, the discourse as a tool, not the goal. Again, sorry.
No, please.
The war, the same war is a tool, is not the goal itself. While if we define these two, the narrative and the war narrative, as two goals, on the other side, we are soaked, immersed every day in a narrative and in a war narrative, and we are confusing. We are thinking that the narrative itself is the reality, is the goal. So we are fighting to counteract the narrative. We are fighting to balance, to address, to be present in order to say, no, that's not true. And again, the war, we are fighting, we are trying to fight on the wrong arena. Let's try to look what are the goals, what are the aims, and not only the tools that are using to arrive from one point to another. We can go back to it later.
I'll try to branch from here to something I'm personally interested in. Next week, there's a data analyst showing up for the podcast, but focuses primarily on media and social media scraping. So looks at how governments can manipulate, how the average citizen can perhaps also shape narrative, and sometimes through disinformation campaigns. And that's a phenomenon of the last few years. I'm trying to think of you in retrospect. You're a long-form writer. You write books as well. You're not a social media phenomenon. And I'm thinking back to the journalists of those years that were still writing for a living here. The person that always comes to mind is Robert Fisk. I don't know if you got the chance to meet him. So Robert Fisk is that kind of heavyweight in journalism. Forget his later years in life, and maybe that is something else. But just in terms of the craft, the storytelling craft, that kind of patience, I think, is gone. And there aren't that many people that are able to reflect that today. I think they're doing exactly the negative side, which is what you're describing. They polarize and they weaponize media. And I do think of your work as trying to offer nuance rather than taking sides. Is that a fair way of shaping your legacy, if you will, the last 23 years, not going from one extreme to the other, but trying to, in a way, define the gray in between? Is that how you see your work?
Yes. Now, yes, of course. But it was a learning process. I didn't start with this luxury of having learned everything in a while. I came here in Lebanon, for instance, with such an orientalistic idea of how to describe Lebanese society, for instance. And it took a while to dismantle with a daily practice, with a daily facing daily challenges, talking to people, discussing, sometimes also arguing with people in order to understand the nuances that are in the daily complexity of the life. So being in the territory, being on the ground, being involved also from a family perspective, that was an added value of my learning process.
From a family perspective?
Yeah, because I got married here to a Lebanese woman. I got 2 children. I raised 2 children, and I struggled to bring them here with the strollers on the Beirut sidewalks. Not only my family, let's say, side helped me understanding nuances, but of course,
you've just made me feel so old. From the Vespa to the stroller with 2 children, it's the same street.
Exactly. Full of many obstacles, by the way.
On both Vespa and stroller.
So, living 30-60 degree in a situation, I didn't become Lebanese, but I learned without really acknowledging sometimes the nuances that are naturally, as are in my original city, Rome, and so on, in my family, in my original family. So that's why I started from a point, and then I grew up. And now of course, not now, but even since many years, I'm really pushing hard in order to show these nuances. That's why a long format, a book, is giving me a little bit of breath while I need to write. When I need to write 20 lines for ANSA, the name is ANSA. In Italy, it's very known, but outside Italy, it's not so well known. It could be very frustrating to try to explain the complexity of a fact, of a background in 20 lines. But that's part of my job, and it's fine. I really enjoy when I have one chapter.
Yeah.
But again, flexibility and be able to adapt to the situations.
I'll squeeze in one question about academia. Do you find that frustration in the classroom too? That students are less eager today to go through that long form process, and maybe they skip that altogether and go through the sound bites. 20 lines is still good. Sometimes it's actually just a few seconds. So do you find that in academic circles as well? That's sort of the similar frustration, that your audience has changed.
Actually, I'm not teaching so systematically in Italy in order to have an enough amount of experience to compare and to tell you something, let's say, solid on this. I would say that when I'm visiting professor and giving seminars to academic audiences, my main challenge is the lack of knowledge. Students on their 20s have of the basic geography and basic history of the Mediterranean area. I'm not asking them to locate Deir ez-Zor or Marj-Uyun on a map, because I know that would be a challenge for them, even if it should not be, perhaps. But they lack the basic notions of the last 200 years. They lack the basic notions of what happened and where are things on a map. And that's a challenge. While that could be a result of what you're saying regarding the narrowing focus abilities in readings, in listening, in doing in-depth research. But on the other side, I'm also discover a very good, talented capacities students. Perhaps some of them, you can find some excellence here and there. We're really willing to go back to the library, to look for traditional archive research, to download PDF, of course. PDF are now the main format, but and trying to understand better. But it's becoming a rare encounter.
We've witnessed, our generation has seen that dramatic shift. And I think personally, I don't know if you would share the bleak sentiment. I think it goes towards more polarization and more extremism, at least in the discourse. I think nuance doesn't take the reign anymore. Maybe that's being too hard, but I don't find much nuance today on the subjects we're going to get into, at least. I find it that extremism sells better too. And I use that word carefully. Even in journalism, you get more traction today. And I think that maybe robs the better journalists that are still trying to do this. But I'll save that maybe for the end. Maybe that's being a little too bleak. Let me try to segue to Syria through Lebanon, if you will. Because your journey includes very important occasions here. And you mentioned them briefly. A lot of things happened while you're visiting this country, whether it's the assassinations that you mentioned earlier, the beginning of that string of assassinations, 1559's implementation, and I guess everything that has gone wrong in this country the last 20-some years, at least since you arrived. Do you find it that there's something about this country that perhaps on reflection, when you first arrived, you thought was a bigger problem, and over time you've sort of recalibrated your expectations of the country and maybe what people find to be right and wrong? Because I find a lot of people arrive to Lebanon with certain views that don't match, at least my understanding, of long history and reality. And it comes, I think, from good intentions, not from bad intentions. Have you found yourself measuring your expectations? Or maybe even, and this could be bad, accepting things, even when they still bother you? And I would take it further. You've become Lebanese, even though the citizenship isn't given to you, but by default, you've married a Lebanese woman, you have children that lived here. I think you've paid your dues. So as a Lebanese Italian, have your expectations changed? And including the way you cover the country, have you sort of shifted your priorities?
By the way, then I divorced by the Lebanese woman.
I see.
And I married a Syrian woman. So I don't know if
that's perfect.
It could add a layer of complexity.
That is perfect. That's what we call a segue. Did you say layer of complexity?
And both Lebanon and Syria live happily now in Rome. So let's say that Rome is a little bit part of Lebanon and Syria altogether also.
Thanks
through my
to you.
personal experience. I don't know if thanks or because of me, but anyway.
Have you done it full Lebanese? You all live in the same building? And
not really.
Good, okay.
So perhaps while you were posing the question, I was trying to look for an answer, and I found something that is perhaps the opposite. At the beginning, my impression when I arrived here, again, I was filtered by an Orientalistic attitude, even though I thought that I was already mature enough to not to look at things in this simplistic way. But anyway, at the beginning, I felt that the Lebanese civil society, in its wider sense, I'm not talking about the elitist, small circles of civil society, okay? You, me, all this audience, people who do not have a direct link to militarized groups and doesn't really thinks in a sectarian way of dividing society. So in this wider sense, civil society at that time, it appeared to me less empowered, less able to be aware. The awareness, that's why now I'm thinking loudly. The awareness of the ordinary people at the time seemed to me, let's say, not so widespread. It looked like it was a country full of people who can be easily bought by a zaim or by a narrative. While being here and discovering nuances and the richness of a society, not only in Beirut, especially going even outside Beirut, people are aware. Perhaps they gave up for many reasons. They are trying to escape the country. They are trying to find alternatives to be Lebanese abroad and so on. But they are aware of all the political structures. Of course, not all of them. But if I need to see something that didn't match my expectation, I would say that I came here with a more negative attitude. Like, again, that was a very Orientalistic way to look at things. Like, Lebanon is dominated by a bunch of thieves and criminals and consociationalist.
That word is always hard. Yeah, consociational.
Consociationalist elite, and the rest of the people are disenfranchised, passive people who are only going on for their daily routine life. No, that's not the truth. There are many nuances and complexity in between.
Yeah. That kind of experience here, did it also shape the way you saw Syria? Were you looking at Syria through a Lebanese lens in any way, shape, or form? Or are they separate stories to you? Because I think this can open the door to going back in time as well. Your scholarly work explores that too. I know it's a translated edition. It comes out in English soon, if I understood right.
Yeah, early next year, hopefully.
Early next year. Negotiation and Power in the Middle East, the Roots of Conflicts in Syria and the Region. I think it does allow that segue between the two countries. There are some shared experiences. But did you go to Syria with any of Lebanon on your mind, and did you see Syria at all through this country?
Actually, Ronnie, I don't know when I started looking at things first. Of course, Damascus was the first city I lived in, and it was my vantage point in a certain moment. So I can say that in a certain period of time, I look at Lebanon from Syria, not the opposite.
Other way around.
On the way around. But again, being based in Lebanon, because in Lebanon I could work as a journalist.
Yeah.
In Syria, I could not work as a journalist.
You're right. Sorry, I should have framed it better. The conflict in Syria, the last decade, from the journalism here. You're right. Not first arrival, more the coverage of war, I suppose.
I can say that the readings, the prolonged reading of the reasons of the historiography on the Lebanese war helped me in finding analytical grips in order to not to predict, because we cannot predict anything, but try to not lose the temper, not lose the focus on what could be the next phase in the Syria war. Many times, even if it's a very hard exercise, I try to find parallels within, of course, taking consideration many differences in the two experiences. But we should not forget that these two territories were divided only 100 years ago. And I emphasize only because in the long continuity of history, geography and time are factors that can help us in understanding analogies between the experiences of, now they're told, two peoples. But let us go not only in Arsal, but let us go to Hermel or to even Tripoli. I was 2 days ago in Tripoli, and again, talking to people from Tripoli, I felt that their perception of the Syrian war is much different from the perception that I felt many times talking to people living in Beirut. So even within the Lebanese environment, you can have many distances or proximities towards Syria. That's why it's not so easy to answer your question, because I look at Syria from a Lebanese perspective, but Lebanese perspective is not a unique one. It's not an only Lebanese perspective.
Right. Well, I'm going to try to navigate this section because it can go very deep in history. I'll try not to bore you too much with my questions. And you feel free to interrupt at any point, take the conversation elsewhere if you find it redundant. I look at your work and the stuff I could translate and what you sent me, which is thankfully translated in English already, that it's almost like a parallel story that ends with World War I, and it's almost like what Lebanon would have looked like had it entered a military dictatorship 80 years later. And the flip side, Syria, had it retained its sectarianism, could have ended up looking like Lebanon too. So I agree with that wider, the wider reflection that these are not two separate stories. They're entangled immensely. And I like that you shared Tripoli, the perspective of the war in Tripoli. I think within Syria, you have multiple perspectives too. So it's a very complicated story. But from your writing, I sense you offer equal emphasis on local dynamics and regional dynamics. You're not looking at a geopolitical answer only. You're looking at also how regimes work and how they establish relationships too that are real. These are not forced necessarily. These are not entirely proxy wars too. So I'll try to navigate. Let's open the door at least to your most recent publication. What took you to write that book? And is there, in a way, anything you can offer in terms of maybe the fate of both countries, given that there is a serious geopolitical problem happening, and that seems to outweigh all local attempts on both ends to actually reform or even move on from war? So the emphasis of the book, where did that come from?
Okay. I would like to define few things in order to then to build up on,
Sure.
on them and try to answer. Story is also about discontinuity on a carpet of continuity. We can read history of Syria, but even Lebanon, and many other countries, of course, but now we are focusing on these two areas, from a very classical periodization or divide into periods that are only reflecting the changes at institutional and political military level. We know that before Islam, we had the Byzantine period, then the Umayyad, then the Abbasid, the Seljuks, the Crusaders, Mamluks, Moghuls, Ottomans, French Mandate, and then independence, and then what? These two timelines not only combine more or less the Lebanese and the Syrian region, but are reflecting only one layer, the institutional and political one. And we can say that there is a rupture between the end of the Ottoman Empire, the World War I, World War I, and the French Mandate, and then the French Mandate when ended, another rupture because the independence and so on. Fine, but if we look at other layers, we can find a very deep continuity in pattern dynamics between local, later on national, before it was imperial dimension, and regional and international dimensions. We were always, even where we were fighting between Maronite and Druze in Mount Lebanon in 1840, we are always immersed into a local, perhaps primordial national, regional, and international dynamic. It's nothing so contemporary or so modern. Again, what is the link between a local and the national story, for instance? Because, okay, we can find books regarding the story of Lebanon with this periodization, again, for Syria. And then we go to the library in Hamra, Bisan, or other libraries that perhaps are more specialized, very dusty library bookshops, sorry. And we can look for local history of Jabal Amel. I need to know something about the local elites of Marjoyun or Tripoli or what else, some Zahli and so on. For, again, the same for Syria. And then we are we live in a disconnected world. Okay, we are focused on a local histories, and then we are not looking at what happened at the national or the regional scale. But these two wars should be combined. And a good historiographer need to always combine the dimensional scales. And what is the connections? The connections, that's the core argument of my book that was published in Italian last year, and I'm working on an English version, updated version for next year, is the role of intermediary figures, the role of not necessarily local petty notables or elites, but also central, imperial, and regional intermediary figures that are connecting the dots between the so-called centers and the peripheries. Again, centers and peripheries are very subjective categories because Zahle is very central from a Rayak perspective, but is very peripheral from a Beirut
perspective too. Perhaps too central. So peripheral doesn't mean geography only. It's more like administration.
Administration politically. Yeah. How many connections, how many dots, how many relationships are channeling towards this node of the web, of the network. Quantitatively, we can also measure what are the centers, but throughout time, of course, because the centers can change over time. Just give me a little bit more time because I'm really arriving to...
You have all the time. I mean, look, it's a full... I think everyone's here just to listen to you, so I'm going to shut up and let you talk.
No, not at all. But
Okay, good. The mic is yours.
No, but I wanted to... because that's... I think we are...
It's an honor. It's an honor to sit with you, Lorenzo. So, take as much time as you'd like.
Thank you. No, but help me because, of course, I'm escorting and I'm walking through this conversation.
3 in the morning, we're gonna go.
So, thank you. We are living into a so-called post-Westphalian order. It means after the Westphalia peace, we are taking for granted that the order of the world is shaped by a national state. So we are Lebanese, we are Syrians, we are Italian, and so on. Because national borders, national sovereignty, and everything is true and sacred, sometimes like religious, like dogmas. But especially in this region, there was also another order before this nation state creation. What were at the time the centers of power, of the institutional center? For many centuries, Istanbul was the center of powers. But cities like Tripoli, Beirut, later on Beirut, Mosul, Aleppo, Damascus were the capital cities of these areas. And the connections between the center of power and the capital cities were not only through basic institutions or only through asking people to pay taxes. Through many local intermediaries coming from Beirut, coming from the heart of these cities. There were Aleppian, Damascene, Beiruti, Tripolitani, and so on, expressing their grievances in the capital. But then later on, that's why continuity. Do not focus on changing of the national state order. But when the French arrived here, they imposed a new order, but with the same pattern dynamic. The center of the decision-making process became Paris. Beirut or Damascus became the local capital of this new central of power. But again, the intermediary figures coming from Beirut, from Damascus and so on, they were already playing and they were still playing a role. Let's imagine again, I'm naming Tripoli. Why Tripoli and the surrounding area of the north of nowadays northern Lebanon expressed opposition to the project of Greater Lebanon? Not only for wide political or pan-Arabism factors that could be, but also there was a new recent rivalry between Tripoli that for many centuries was a center of power since the Mamluk period, and the new emerged city of Beirut that until 1830 was a small village.
I think it was a few weeks ago, someone reminded me something like 10,000 only in the early 19th century, which is insane. And by the turn of the 20th century, it's hitting 100,000. So that's multiple-fold increase. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
So when the notables in Tripoli were trying to express their opposition to this new national project, they were negotiating their their desire to be kept alive as a central intermediaries figure between their constituencies and the central power. They lost the game in favor of a new capital city that became Beirut. Nowadays, we can see the traces of these issues. Again, between we pass from one or political order to another one, but the dynamics among cities, among local and regional actors keep more or less the same. When we are looking at the Syria war, and we are looking at the dynamics of the Syrian history after the independence and so on, we can look at the developments of the last 13 years, also in light of a struggle for dominance in some political centers within Syria and outside Syria, among local actors. It's not only Bashar al-Assad, the issue. Bashar al-Assad is within a complex articulation of interactions. Perhaps his father, Hafez al-Assad, was more effectively the top layers of a decision-making process. But again, he was the intermediary of other regional and international top players, while his son, Bashar al-Assad, gradually lost some of its power. And perhaps we can also talk about how much power has Bashar al-Assad and its surrounding circles nowadays in Syria. But again, it's a matter of negotiating my position, my capacities to exercise power at local level, and then to connect my power to other top level. Even a national leader could be the intermediary of other regional players. We can name one. I don't think he will be angry for that. But Nabi Berri, one of the most long-standing Lebanese leader in both institutional and non-institutional power dynamics, when he's meeting one of the leader of a small neighborhood in an area that his movement controls, the relationship of power between Nabi Berri and this small, tiny local leader, of course, are in favor of Nabi Berri. And Nabi Berri expresses his benevolence, his ability to exert power to a lower level. But when a special envoy from the United States arrives and talks to Nabi Berri, the relationship of power could be altered. And you can see Nabi Berri in a framework of another spatial dynamic. Where is Nabi Berri there? Is the main dominant actor, or is one of the pieces of a wider puzzle?
And so just intermediary doesn't have to be a person. It can also be an institution, or is it more person-driven?
That's a very good question. Institutions are tools in order to express, to formalize, to legitimize this kind of aura, this kind of ability to negotiate. So you need to be, as much as you can, within the institutions, always keeping your feet outside the institutions, because you have to manage many things. But the institution itself could be an empty shell.
Yeah.
The individual factor, sometimes we are forgetting the need to read biographies. How important is to understand, since the childhood of this leader, what happened, how is looking at the world in this way. We need to really to look at not autobiography, but to biographies of leaders, even of humble people, to understand how the individual factors could emerge, even in a society that is described, such as the Lebanese one or the Syrian one, is a society that are described like driven by collectivity. I don't remember who taught me, who explained me Lebanon here. Perhaps a long friend of mine, Saad Kiwan, told me the difference between being a fard, an individual, and being a part of a community. Something that is described in Europe as an individualistic society. While in Lebanon, we are living I am Lorenzo. My identity is reflected because I'm a part of a community. I'm not because I'm Lorenzo. But that is very relevant to the discussion on Muatan, on the issue on the citizenship and the rights. I want now to make it too long. But anyway, in a society that is so overwhelmed by the collectivity power, individual factors, are shaping institutions too. Let us assume how Nabi Berri itself, again, I hope he won't be...
He's a big fan. He donates every week. He's a #1 subscriber to the podcast.
So,
be very nice to him.
Let's imagine the institution of the presidency of the parliament, even in the last legislative mandate, how could be managed in a different way with another interpreter. It could change a lot, the individual factor. Don't you agree?
You know, I struggle with it because I thought of it before we came, whether or not it's, if behavior changes if individuals replaced has any impact on circumstance. I don't know. I do find institutions playing a bigger role perhaps than individuals, and not in a good way, more in a paralyzed way. But maybe we can save that to later, because that I think better describes the reality we're living in right now. I'm going to ask you, since you're far better qualified than I am, I forget my history too often. The Syrian Mandate, the political framework of that mandate, remind me, was it similar to Lebanon's in terms of quasi-sectarian already? Was there a power-sharing consociationalism in Syria? Or was that removed earlier than... I can't remember the mandate political framework in Syria.
Thank you, Ronnie. From the French perspective, the political framework was to be applied in a similar way. And then, if we can remember, the very initial years of the French mandate on Syria, they wanted to replicate, let's say, the Lebanese formula in having an Alawite state along the coast, let's say Tartus, Latakia, and Banyas, a Druze state around Sueda and Jabal Druze, Jabal Arab.
And these are the states that emerged, and for months only, if I'm not mistaken, right? This is...
Yeah, we're talking about a very small period of time.
Yeah.
And then there was the state of Aleppo, and the remaining state of Damascus. Again, the idea was the classical divide et impera theory along communal lines. What changed was the social and political, let's say, fabric of the two geographical areas. Because Mount Lebanon, that was the core of the new Greater Lebanon, had an history, a recent history, because 1840, 1860, we have two waves of bloody confrontations that reverberated to Damascus in 1860. But again, the Syrian land was so, in a way, diverse, and also the Syrian population was mixed in a way that was not the same mixture of the Lebanese tiny territory, of the new Lebanese tiny territory. So the French needed to adapt. That's why we could look at the French experience in both Syria and Lebanon in a way how they more or less quickly adapt their original political framework project to something that was changed, negotiating with the local elites. Again, it was not only a top-down dynamic, Ronnie. It is never an occupant or the bad colonial power that is enforcing its authorities from above, and then the passive local actors who are receiving, applauding, or protesting. There was a continuous negotiations here in Lebanon, in the newly Lebanon, and in a new became French Syria.
Aside from those statelets that emerged and then quickly disappeared, was there something that resembled Lebanon's experience in those years? In other words, was there an idea of communal power sharing at play? Because I'm always interested in Syria's trajectory and Lebanon's. And if we're going to assume that these societies are closer than people assume, that sectarianism or the power sharing itself seems to be rejected early on in Syria and not here. And I agree with you, these could be bottom-up issues too. I don't necessarily think these are top-down exclusively. So maybe why Syria rejected a sectarian model? Is that more French mandate history? Or does that have anything to do with post-independence? I know Syria went through multiple regime changes early on. And there's at times, perhaps month by month, governments come and go. But sectarianism, how does that factor into Syria? Political sectarianism.
Again, we should go, it's a multiple factors. Now, we cannot go through all the details, but first of all, in Syria, we had two major city hubs, Damascus and Aleppo. They were not divided along sectarian lines. Aleppo and its countryside, and Damascus and its countryside, you cannot really define them as two different poles from a communal point of view. Then you had the coastal side that again was more or less described as an Alawite region, but it was a mixture of many other sects. The Druze area was emerging because many Druzes escaped from Mount Lebanon and arrived to Jabal Druze. So even the Druze area was relatively a new homogeneous sectarian shape. The local leaderships at that time, both in Aleppo, Damascus, Sweden, and elsewhere, were not, let's say, refusing this model, but they were struggling for imposing themselves as local leaders within a national plan. They understood, but that is retrospectively, of course, it's hard to be sure of that. They understood that the only way that they can have a longevity in power and have a continuity with their recent past during the Ottoman time was to be part of a wider national project that by nature, for these diverse and also fractured territorial, communal composition, could not be under a sectarian umbrella. I don't know if I made myself clear.
Well, I'm trying to link it to intermediaries. Here in this country, they emerge quickly. And those are names that in a way define rejection to French rule and independent Lebanon. Whether it's Riyad al-Sulh, who's that intermediary trying to persuade Saida and Tripoli to join in. You referred to Tripoli earlier. You have that kind of, maybe that unexpected leader, Bashar al-Khoury, who convinces most mountain Christians that they can live side by side with the coast. And you have that kind of, those intermediaries are playing a role. Is it that in Syria they're not playing as large of a political role, and therefore you don't have that communal power sharing taking hold? Because there seems to be a rejection of it early on, trying to understand why Syria goes a completely different direction.
Perhaps they went in a completely different directions, but the distance between two directions became clear afterwards, many years.
Sorry, one more example. Even for Sheb, who's the closest we get to military rule, in that post-World War II sense, he cannot shake off the sectarianism of Lebanon. So even our flirtation with it doesn't go in that direction. So sorry to interrupt, but I was trying to compare.
Yeah, no, comparison, it's very revealing. It's very helpful. From let's say a new Syrian perspective, the political leaderships at that time, first of all, they all grew up, they were all formed into the Ottoman schools of policy making. Reading their biographies, all of them, even in Lebanon, they grew up in Ottoman schools, military, civil schools. They made the school of governance, we can say, at the time in Istanbul. So even from it was an Ottoman generation taking, let's say, the burden of the new state. But this civil leadership in Syria were mostly coming from the main traditional cities that were not dominated by so-called, let's say, minorities, later on called minorities. Let's say the Alawites and the Druze were not playing a major role as the other Aleppian Damascus in the first, let's say, decade after the independence. You mentioned many coup d'etat between 46, especially in 49, we had 3 coup d'etat in 1 year by military rulers. All of them learned in the Ottoman School of Istanbul. These new leaderships were expressing the Damascus and the Aleppian sentiment, let's say. They were not really representing so much Far Eastern Deir ez-Zor or Raqqa or Hasake, forgotten places among, in brackets. And the Alawite communities became prominent many years later, let's say around 1 decade later, in the 50s, through which other? The military academies, not through the civil administrative post-French institutions. They took over through the window, let's say. The military rule you were referring to, the authoritarian system that, again, is in power since more than half a century. Its history traces back through a negotiation power between a subaltern community, the Alawites, coming from a very impoverished and peripheral, at the time, nowadays very central, areas of the mountains of Latakia, then became, step by step, became into the center of powers.
The merchant class role versus the communal elder role, is that a better way of defining Syria? That there's an urban elite rather than a confessional struggle per se, at least at the transitionary phase when Syria is born as a modern state.
Yeah, we can frame it in this way, but again, the socioeconomic division, the divide, is not the only factor.
Yeah.
But of course, at that time, the belonging to the urban context, beyond being a Sunni or a Christian Orthodox, because again, the Christian Orthodox community in Syria played, such in Saida, Beirut, and Trablus, in Tripoli, a prominent role. So we should not forget this component, the Orthodox Christians in the urban landscape of Syria. But so beyond being Sunni or whatever, we can read this part of Syria like a struggle between a dominant urban elite and a peripheral, more rural, suburban emerging class. But it's not the only way to look at things.
I'll try to fast forward to the system that largely resembles the same one in the last 53 years or so, 54 years of Assad rule. You have, and you described it already, regime changes happening frequently. Upheaval, political upheaval defines Syria post-independence. Hafiz al-Assad, who his father, if I'm remembering right, played a role in that Alawite state early on. At the onset of that state, he may have been in that government for a few months. His name escapes me now.
Suleiman.
Is it Suleiman?
Suleiman, as far as I know, yes.
Yeah.
Perhaps I can be wrong.
I forget his name too.
I think the grandfather of Hafiz.
Sorry, the grandfather, right, not the father.
The grandfather is Suleiman.
Yes.
The father, I don't remember. Perhaps didn't play a major role. That's why I forget him. But he was, he played a role at local level in a very in the negotiations between the Kurdaha elite. Yep. Kurdaha is the chief, is the village, the hamlet, then became a very prominent city, of course, in the Latakia eastern countryside, but didn't play a major role, as far as I know, in the negotiations with the French, let's say at the national scale. But anyway.
But that kind of, the history is alive already, and then his grandson, you have a de facto coup d'etat, and a military rule that has defined modern Syria since. As a scholar, how would you describe that system? I've heard it lazily referred to as secular. I don't think totalitarian is the right word. I think that diminishes it, almost flattens it to the point that it doesn't mean anything. It's clearly not sectarian the way Lebanon understands sectarianism, but there is a sectarian dimension to at least the family and how they operate. So how would you describe this system?
For sure, I won't describe it secular. Secular is one of the narrative issues we need to address.
Yeah, and I actually want to get into that at the end because that's the most interesting one.
Yeah, because the power is since the onset of these changes of relationship between some clans of the Alawite community, because not the entire Alawite community they took power. We should be very careful in that. Since the beginning of this change of dynamics, so we are talking about the late 50s, early 60s, because Hafez al-Assad took power in November 1970. But of course, the process of arriving to the helm of power began years before. Since the beginning, there was a sectarian and communal deep usage to reach some key positions, at first in the military posts and later on civilian, administrative and institutional positions. So sectarianism was clearly used and still has been used by the local and the central power. I would define it authoritarian power. Totalitarian, I agree with you, but anyway, it's broad enough authoritarian to say many things.
Yeah. So authoritarian is that comfortable word to describe it. So that authoritarian system, your book also outlines there's a network in place at a local level, an intermediary one too, that keeps that family and regime intact. So let's go into the survivability of the system as it exists through everything it's been through. And we'll fast forward eventually till the last few years, but how it has remained resilient enough to survive a small uprising in 1982 and a huge uprising in 2011, 2012, and it's still part of the discussion today. So maybe the way it survives, that network.
Usually the appropriate metaphor. Can you pass me the pencil, please?
Of course, yeah.
I won't draw anything, just to... If you have a rigid system of power, under pressures, it will break. More before or after, it will break. If you have the ability to adapt yourself and to be flexible, you will navigate through many storms. So even though the current system of power is de facto weakened, as less extensive, less ability to be capillary all over the country. One of the strengths point was the ability to adapt to contingencies, keeping the same narrative. So from outside perspective, thank you, you can believe, if you are not aware enough, that they are still protecting the values of the Ba'ath Party, of the Arabism and the Pan-Arabism, the fighting against the enemy of Israel. Yeah, we have many examples also in Lebanon about resiliency, but keeping the same narrative. Like you keep the narrative in the fridge and you use whenever you want, but the rest of the power structure can change. For instance, I'll give you an example from the top players analysis. From Hafez al-Assad to Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad disempowered many circles outside of the family. It was a sort of Assadization, a familiarization of the power, empowering people closer by Asabiya, by family relationship. For instance, the Makhlouf family, that was the famous second tire of the second leg of the table of the power, the Makhluf family during Hafez al-Assad was much more present into economic, political, and other management. But later on, since the first years of Bashar al-Assad rule, and later on during the last decade, were step by step put aside. And again, it's very the so-called system of power of the Syrian government that was shaped like two wide shoulders with Hafez al-Assad at the top, but then you have a wide layer of people protecting and stabilizing a huge body that from above went through the last inch of Syria. Nowadays, Bashar al-Assad, not only physically, but also as a metaphor of his power, narrowed down the shoulders of his power and relies on a tiny circle, on a smaller circle of people. That weakened the ability of the power in 2011 to face the first waves of protests and the first sudden waves of political upheaval. And in fact, the very, let's say, 12 months of the initial Syrian uprising, 2011, 2012, many people, many analysts thought that Bashar al-Assad was in a way or another about to collapse. Then many other outside the country mainly played an effective role in order to keep the balance as it is now.
I'm going to try to navigate this stuff, which is harder to do, while keeping it relevant to the book as well. That network of relationships and intermediaries, 1970, Hafez al-Assad inherits power. 6 years later, an otherwise weak, broken political system since independence is suddenly appearing to be strong, organized, and able to play a role in Lebanon too. This Syrian army, which was not the most organized army in 1969, suddenly has what appears to be a somewhat sophisticated general at the helm, Hafez al-Assad, playing a critical role in the future of Lebanon. In your scholarly work and your own reflections, and I know you've read and written about this much more than I think anyone else I know that I've spoken to, with the exception of Ziad Majid. You look a lot like him too, by the way, which is good. It's good. But that kind of determination to get involved quickly into Lebanese affairs, it almost seems like it circles it back to the initial part of the conversation, which is there is a relationship here that's real. Except with the Syrian system's journey, it looks like it's more out of survivability other than anything else, playing a critical role in the politics of Lebanon and able to escalate and sometimes de-escalate, but suddenly Syria is involved. So does that factor into the system as well? That what we have now is a regime that depends on that too?
We can talk about Hafez al-Assad. Again, the individual factor played a crucial role. Hafez al-Assad, as an individual, brought to Lebanese-Syrian dynamic a new flavor that was already present there as a potential trigger, but he used it in a crucial way, also supported by contingencies, regional and international contingencies. So it was a mixture of factors: the individual capability, the geography, because geography doesn't lie. Just would like to remind that Hafez al-Assad never came to Beirut, never visited Lebanon officially, unless once he met Elias Harhawi in Zahle or in Shtura.
I think Shtura.
Yeah. He didn't pass Mount Lebanon.
It's true.
Why? Of course, it was not by coincidence, but knowing the fact that since 15 years before that visit in Shtura, the Bekaa Valley administratively was managed for many centuries from the capital, the Vilayet capital of Damascus. And nowadays, even when you go to Shtura and to Zahle and you pass Dahr el-Baidar, you have the feeling that you are going to another realm without saying Lebanon or Syria. I want to enter into this cheap job. But Hafez al-Assad played with the fact that geography surrounding Lebanon is almost Syrian geography. So they will always have, from a Syrian political, military perspective, the overwhelming ability to come back to what they perceived their courtyard, starting from the Bekaa Valley. And again, the main corridor of weapons and supplies that is bombed not on a daily basis by Israel, Hermel today, or the Qusair 2012 military offensive by Hezbollah in Syria, reflected the powerful of geography, the connection between these two geography. That's why I wanted to answer your question.
Yeah, of course.
The fact that Syria played at that time a very powerful role, not because the Syrian army at the time was well prepared enough like the Iraqi army at the time or the Jordanian one, but because they have this political advantage and also the blessing in a way or another of the at the time the geopolitical powers. They allowed Syria under the umbrella of the League Arab contingents, because Syria didn't came in 76 with the Syrian flag. Yeah, with the Syrian flag, but under the umbrella of something created for the narrative. The green helmets, however they were called.
But I'm trying to think of the role of an intermediary and keeping a system intact. Is it fair to describe Hafez al-Assad as determined to become an intermediary himself? So that, in other words, he's playing a bigger role that brings the local to the regional. And I'll give you an example. It's the Syrian regime that's consulted always in terms of Lebanese affairs. And also, Lebanese actors are visiting Syria for the better part of maybe 3 decades. So that kind of critical role that is, to me, it sounds intermediary by design. Is that a fair description of the regime and how it behaves?
Perfect.
Thank you.
Exactly.
Okay, let me one second. We've run over a bit. Is everyone okay staying a bit longer tonight? Yeah? 30 more minutes? Is that okay for you as well? Or do you need to...
No.
You sure?
Yeah, I'm sure.
You're happy? Okay.
I'm happy.
So I can, because we've already passed the usual recording length, but I'd like to keep going if that's okay for you.
Yeah, for me, if the audience, it's fine, yes.
I think everyone's okay with it,
Okay.
all right? Yeah? Okay, let's keep going. So that is the way to describe it. Okay.
But so just to remind ourselves that even the head of state, the so powerful Hafez al-Assad at the time, played a role. If we look at from the USSR Soviet perspective, he was a mediator. He was a tiny mediator.
Yes.
In comparison, from a Beirut perspective,
he's the king.
Was the king. But again, you go to Hafez al-Assad to pass the messages sometimes to other layers.
Yeah. Let's bring in the story of regional dynamics and how these regimes evolve. One could actually be very cynical and say that Syria's occupation of Lebanon keeps the Assad regime going longer than maybe it would have. And then it's Hezbollah that preserves the Syrian regime in return, fast forwarded until today. So the role of conflict and how these regimes either bend or perhaps become part of that conflict too. In your research, does geopolitics determine the fate, let's say, of these regimes and these systems? Or do you find still more emphasis on the natural networks that these actors use and abuse? So in other words, you take away the geopolitical dimension, you could still well have something like Bashar al-Assad in Syria using the same networks too. And if you remove Iran from the story and there's no armed Hezbollah, Lebanon is still exposed to the same natural tendencies. So trying to see how geopolitics actually factors in.
Thank you, Ronnie. You give me the chance also to clarify something that, generally speaking, geopolitics is being conceived like the regional and international dimensions. While even in Beirut, we are witnessing geopolitical dynamics. Geopolitics is also a matter of how we look at geographical spatial dimensions. So even in the neighborhood, we can have geopolitical dimensions because geography and politics are part of our daily complexities.
So geopolitics within a neighborhood, what would that look like?
We need to map the neighborhood to understand who does what.
Okay.
Who are the powerful entities, individual, collectives, and so on, and try to see how they see themselves in this specific physical, tangible environment.
So it's almost like network analysis in a sense.
But applied to the geography.
Applied to geography, yeah.
I give you an anecdote.
Yeah.
At the time, a prominent member of parliament of Lebanon used to live close to the Serrail, to the Grand Serrail. Another prominent member of parliament tried to bought his penthouse roof because he wanted to have an upper view from above. He didn't want to be under the look of the other member of parliament.
Yeah.
The fact that I occupy an upper position in a small, tiny, or that my place is very close to a generator, and I'm talking about resources, electric generator, is very tied to geopolitics because managing resources and distribution of services is part of how I became more powerful than you. So give me a generator and I can change the dynamic in the neighborhood. But the position to the generator, it also affects how much costs the amperage every month because the length of the cables and so on. But who is closer to the generator? Of course, I'm oversimplifying things, but just because I wanted to track back the geopolitical, let's say, narratives to something very close to our experience. So in order to answer your question, partially true, but conflicts are multifactorial. We cannot oversimplify in saying that Hezbollah saved the stability of the power of Hafez al-Assad. First of all, Hezbollah intervened in Syria in 2012, not in 2013, like the official timeline says. But I remember many posters in Khandaq al-Ghamik and in many Hezbollah-controlled areas were already in 2012 stating the martyrs Fulan died, we don't know where, but already 2012. And that, again, I need to emphasize the timeline could be misconceiving. Many months before Nasrallah announced the intervention to protect Shia communities along the border, Hezbollah was already militarily involved in Syria in 2012. But they intervened to protect their own interests, even perhaps the interest of their regional ally, Iran. And Qusair, the Battle of Qusair was one of the major, let's say, the clear example of how they wanted to protect. So protecting Assad was also mainly to protect their own stability. Again, can we simply say that a conflict is driven by economic or energetic interests? Many times in Italy, but even in Europe, they are oversimplifying things, saying, Qatar or Saudi Arabia, these are the main troublemakers in the region or Turkey, because they want Syria, they want to have influence in this part of Syria in order to influence the passage of a pipeline. Or again, the US are physically present now, 10 years now, the US, not the other guys, in northeastern Syria and eastern Syria only for protecting the oil facilities. That is part of the puzzle, but it's not the only explanation. My approach, I'm not siding only with one explanation. I'm not denying it. We should not do the counter-narrative denying all the rest, but we should be able to embrace the complexity and to always, Ronnie, think of, okay, there is something missing. Perhaps I'm not counting on something else. because many times listening to people and looking at things, there is always something missing. So uncertainty is part of our job as researchers and journalists. And we should take into consideration that perhaps if I saw things always from an energetic or socioeconomic lenses, I need to complementary with other lenses. I need to be interdisciplinary. It's a very buzzword nowadays, at least in Europe. I don't know in Lebanon.
But as best as you can describe the dependency, let's say, or no, you know what? I'll go with the local actor doing things on their behalf without necessarily looking at the regional dynamic. You're absolutely right. There can be autonomous decisions taken that have nothing to do with wider geopolitics. But
no, sorry.
You know, no.
They are all connected. I didn't want to say that geopolitics doesn't matter. It matters a lot, coupled with the other layers.
Right. So that kind of coupling, let's say, in your research, do you find yourself leaning in any direction? I know maybe that's a bad question to ask because the purpose is nuance. I don't think any journalist would write a scholarly book unless their goal is nuance. But within all that research, are you actually re-examining your own assumptions about Syria? Because I hear it, maybe I'm not hearing it correctly, that you do lean more on local dynamics than most analysts do when it comes to these news bites and constant chatter on everything happening in Syria. Is that a fair assertion?
Partially, yes. I can tell you how I revise my assumptions.
Okay, yeah.
When I did my PhD and then my main book on Syria 10 years ago, I was really investigating the top players of power. Bashar al-Assad and this group of people could be the explanation, could be the lenses in order to understand everything. But then, for many reasons, in 2011 made the Syrians outside Syria too. So I had the chance to encounter many Syrians that I couldn't really meet when I was in Syria. I met people from all over the country outside Syria. And local complexity entered into my under my eyes. And so at the beginning, I thought I should shift to the local. I should really forget the top players. But later on, when you are growing up, you are always trying many sports, many things. But at the end of the day, you need to grow up and to find the balance. So I'm always doing, like many analysts, looking at the geopolitical as in the general point of view, let's say the big game from abroad. Also for LiMes, the review, LiMes, it means border in in Latin. They're asking me always to look at things from a macro point of view. Yeah. And I'm abiding, like ANSA, I'm abiding writing 20 lines without explaining complexity. LiMes is asking me to look at things from a very geopolitical, in this sense, point of view. I'm doing my job, okay, but because their audience is not so interested in understanding Ramesh, what happened in Ramesh. I wrote 20 pages on the negotiations in Ramesh. Who does read Ramesh negotiation in Italy? Myself and I don't have a cat. If I would have a cat, my cat perhaps would have read Ramesh, but Ramesh is a tiny village. Many Lebanese doesn't know where Ramesh is, perhaps. So, but Ramesh is connected to a regional. That's why in my learning process, again, I'm trying to find a balance always between the two. When we hear a speech of a famous leader of an armed party, is talking to his small local audience, but is also sending messages to Washington. Yeah. We need always to be this multitasking, multi-layer brain to read things.
So you're trying to offer just the right amount of time to each part of the story. I think that's probably...
If I have the space and the format, yes.
Yeah. And that could probably best be done in a book.
Exactly. The book, finally, I really enjoyed, because this book, the book that I published on last year, I felt like, okay, after this, I can even die. Because after that, I told what I had to tell until now, because that's what I understood after 20 years of Lebanon and Syria. Now I really tell you guys, what I have in my pocket. And I try to do it in a systematic way. But then, of course, I found other things to say. That's why I'm preparing new things. But
this natural, not natural, let's say the reality of networks that leaders use and manipulate, and then the lifeline support that can come from external parties. I think that is, in a way, shaping a lot of these rogue regimes, or let's say authoritarian ones, because they do come to the rescue. I mean, Putin does bomb Syria for a reason, more recently than 20 years ago. Hezbollah is in Syria in 2012, not in 2011 or 10. So I think that they all deserve their attention. But the difficulty of trying to simplify geopolitics on Instagram, I think that's impossible. And sometimes you pull it off. I mean, you're taking all of your research and putting it on a post on Instagram. It's difficult, and especially with what's happening now. I'm going to wrap up the conversation with the hardest subject, which is everything we're looking at right now, and whether it's Ramesh, whether it's Gaza, whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas, Israel, this kind of geopolitical tragedy. In your own analysis, are you still able to offer nuance through this kind of dilemma? I mean, are you able to fully... You were talking about Ramesh today. Are you able to do that? I wouldn't know how. For me, it would be maybe it's almost become binary. And I don't know how to offer nuance in this discussion.
I think I would end in writing a novel. No, I'm serious. I'm reading in these very days, by chance, I'm reading again, after many years, a book that was written by Carlo Levi in Italian. Christ stopped at Eboli. Cristo si è fermato a Eboli in Italian. And behind let's say the story itself and the context, the historical and geographical context where the story is set, is doing an ethnography, and while telling about his encounters, is picturing a complex local dynamics in a specific time and specific geography, telling how power functions in a small, forgotten locality in southern Italy in the late 30s. So the way Carlo Levi, for instance, describes complexity is perhaps the arriving harbor of my production. When I wrote about 20 pages on Hormesh negotiations, I found many things missing. I took away many things, but I cannot write a book in Italian about Hormesh. It's something that is not really... So perhaps I need to write a story of a human being in Hormesh being able to describe all the complexity that we live. Because if we tell our story, what's happening here and there, talking to people, negotiating during our daily lives for power in our tiny, humble experience, I'm sure many nuances are there. While we read things from the geopolitical perspective, it lacks a lot of things. The Iranians will do that. Israel will do that. Hezbollah. Be careful. Be careful. Why are you daring to make dirty our so beautiful complexity? I've met, for instance, a political representative of this party in a place of Lebanon. I cannot disclose all the details, but just to say that when I became friend with this guy, I entered into his family dynamics. I entered into this work dynamics, and I also felt the complexity of being a member of this party in a 3 dimension. The only way to narrate, to tell the story of this guy could be a novel. Yeah. The only way, in order not to disrupt, not to be a traitor of the complexity. And that is not because I want to take sides, Ronnie, or to justify the political leadership armed violence towards other human beings, but to understand why so many people in a country are genuinely supporting a political structure. Because I found many times without an answer asking myself, but why people are are so easily mobilized? It's not they're telling you because they are paid. And then again in Syria, when 2011 they emerged in the street, the oversimplification was because they are paid or because they are under the drugs. Like the ISIS people are under Captagon effects. No, guys, there are many other factors, many other genuine factors that we are not forced to go have dinner with these guys. We should not agree politically, ideologically with these guys, but we need, at least my profession, my human being, let's say, role is to try to understand and also to tell what I understood or why this human being called Ronnie is doing that.
It's a great phrase, trader of complexity. You don't want to be a trader of complexity. You know, the novel, I'm going to try to wrap it up with a few things because they've stuck with me since we started talking. The novel, and if you have the patience still to write, I think my relationship to the Civil War is still through Pity the Nation. I still read that book, and it's a journalist trying to write a story, and he's a fantastic storyteller. I think that kind of medium does shape perspectives. So if you have the stomach for it, I look forward to reading that book. I hope it's translated as well. There's something that happened, I think, which is partially narrative war too, is that there's a lot of myth busting happening. I mean, the Syrian regime today cannot easily just fly a Palestinian flag alongside the Syrian flag and get away with it. And we know that. Tens of thousands, if not more. And you have refugees slaughtered in Syria. There is a certain, I think, effort at still trying to recapture that, but it does fall flat. I think at least to enough Syrians, Lebanese, that they're not getting away with that kind of narrative any longer. But the trader of complexity, that I think that's the best way to describe a lot of people that prefer the audience growth and the short-term gains of polarization. You've steered away from that entirely. Also, this conversation couldn't have happened when we first met at Torino 20 years ago. Now we can talk about that regime all the time and not fear about anything. 20 years ago, these would have been whispers on the streets of Beirut. So time has changed too. There's a lot of other stuff we could have explored. We have, unfortunately, some limited time at Aaliya's, but the Q&A will let the audience ask whatever they want, if that's okay. I think it's 8 o'clock. Yes, past 8. You can order wine and cheese if you'd like. It's an Aaliya's special. Let's take 10 minutes, and we'll be back with Lorenzo. Thanks to everyone. Thank you, sir. Is there anyone that has a question up front before I interject? I know Wa'il Hajj in the back had something to ask earlier. The man with the beard. He's a big fan of yours, by the way. Maybe we can get the mic to Wa'il to begin with. He's also a big fan of Ziad Majid. So, yeah.
And Torino, by the way.
And Torino.
And Torino. Something you said earlier on that caught my interest. Thank you, Ronnie, for putting me on the spot. I appreciate that. You mentioned, when you were talking about geopolitics and how also, even within smaller intricacies come in and nuances, kind of reminded me of a hub and spoke kind of model. Now, I don't know if that applies in that sense, but I'm curious if you were to impose that on, how things were happening at the top, geopolitical sense, and then, who would you say were the hubs? At some point, fine, it was the polar opposites. You had the US in the West versus USSR at the time, but then things changed. More recently, how would you consider, who would you consider the hub to be in Lebanon's case and then in Syria's case with all those regional players coming into play?
If I understood well, and correct me in case I didn't understood well, who are the major international regional powers who are shaping the game both in Syria and in Lebanon nowadays? Is it?
Yeah, to some extent, yeah.
Okay. First of all, we need to look at who has a ground presence on the ground in Syria and also in Lebanon. But in Syria is so clear, as we have the Russians, the Iranians, the Turkish, the Americans, officially, more or less, not necessarily legitimized to be there, but officially since many years. And when you have presence on the ground, of course, you have more tools in order to affect dynamics. In Lebanon, even though there is no such partition, but there is a sort of post-colonial tradition. For instance, you have the so-called French party of many Lebanese nationals who have double French passports, and many of them are also members of parliaments. I'm just giving an example of France, how history, its weight could play nowadays a role in shaping indirect and soft power pressures. Because if you have interests in France, if your children are studying in Paris, if you have a flat, an apartment in Paris, or moreover, if you manage businesses around the Mediterranean and your base is Marseille, perhaps you will think twice when you should sideline with something that is opposing French interests in Lebanon. Again, that's why we need the local and the individual dimension. We need to do our homeworks, understanding who does what at a very micro scale, in order to also to link to why a significant portion of political leaders in Lebanon are behaving in a way. I just gave example of France, but we can do the same exercise with other regional powers. Of course, Iran has a strong and clear influence on many Lebanese regions. And one of the questions is, for instance, how Russia was able or unable to capitalize its influence in Syria into Lebanon. Perhaps that's a question of mine to Ronnie or to some of you. I didn't have a clear answer on that, but it's an interesting question to see how the Ukrainian-Russian war changed or not changed the balance of powers between the US and the Russians in Lebanon. I don't know if I answer your question. It's not an exhaustive way of replying to you, but I named the few main. But we should not forget in Syria, Israel. Israel is not playing a physical role in being here and there, but is playing since many years a military role in counterbalancing from their own perspective the Iranian influence or the Iranian presence along few key strategic supply lines. So again, Israel sometimes somehow forgotten by the usual suspects of who's involved in Syria, but we should also mention Syria up front. Israel, sorry, up front.
Let me add to Wael's question and go back in time. The French history in this country obviously predates the French Mandate. the French language already has its adherents in the country long before the French Mandate starts. And the French Mandate just expands that, and suddenly you have a bilingual country by the 1940s. Did Syria go through something similar? In other words, did the French experience in Syria mimic Lebanon's pre-independence? Did you have Syrians with French passports? That kind of relationship you're talking about between Lebanon and France, was that felt in Syria?
Again, history, pre-French Mandate history played a role in shaping two different tracks, I would say. Because how Beirut, more or less Beirut, more than Lebanon, as the capital of the new way of negotiation between the colonial powers and emerging local elites. Beirut, in a different way from Damascus, played a role of being available, the famous comptoir idea of being able to negotiate. We are here, we are able to find agreements, to find compromise with the new European powers who were trying to co-opt, include the resources of Mount Lebanon, and not only Mount Lebanon, into at that time, the global economy. Lebanese elite were more prone than the Damascene ones and the Aleppians one, but the Damascene ones, to be able to interact in a positive, soft attitude with the newcomers. So when the French interacted with this new elite in Beirut, where they had more leverage, they had more similar language. I give you an example of Alfred Surso. By the way, I worked in 2009, 2010 in digitalizing, discovering, giving value to this unpublished at the time archive of a notable family of Beirut, right up the hill here, the Alfred Sursock archive. Alfred Sursock was an emerging nouveau riche, we can say at the time, without offending anybody, the Sursock family, emerging elite that understood that the new game was in the hands of the French. And he shifted. He was the third consul at the Ottoman embassy in Paris. Yeah. So he was an Ottoman administrative Lebanese Beiruti representative. But between the 18, the 19, and the 20, understood that the world was changing. The new order was coming. He needed to adapt to the new situation and sell himself in a positive way to the new French political order. You cannot find so easily an Alfred Sursock in Damascus. Yeah. For their history, the weight of history and the powerful of the Damascus bourgeoisie, as it is shaped for so many years, it was much more difficult for the French to penetrate and to negotiate with them and to divide them and to co-opt them and to weaken them. While for Beirut, they have a very fresh, new, juvenile, if you want, elite, ready to I lost the word, to compete in order to be at the forefront of the new order. By the way, I would like to quote Mahmoud Haidar. Some of the things that I'm developing with you today are also the result of lengthy conversation I had since 1 year and a half with this, I think, for me, one of the most enlightening source of knowledge about Lebanon, and not only, Mahmoud Haidar, that doesn't publish so much. He taught at AUB, some Fares Institute, and he taught public muassasat amme, public policies, and it really helped me in the last couple of years in developing my rough, let's say, methodology on how understanding complexity, and it helped me in translating into some Lebanese nuances. So again, we should quote our masters, we should give them credits, and also we should continue to discuss with them. Some of the nuances I've learned through Mahmoud Haidar are also part of my nowadays reflection. I wanted to stress that.
When I met you 20 years ago, I was living in Kamal Salibi's music school in Hamra. So he had his own way of impacting me too. You know, it's nice to actually hear these names coming up. I haven't heard Mahmoud Haidar's name ever on the podcast.
But you should have here.
Yeah. I actually ran into Fawaz Trabulsi over the weekend with this gentleman sitting at the front. Actually, I'm going to let him ask the next question. He came all the way from Mount Lebanon. That's Federico. He's a fan of yours too. Let's give the microphone to Federico. Fawaz Trabulsi was having dinner next to us.
Yeah.
And these are legends in their own right. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Federico.
No, first of all, thanks for the interesting debate. Before you were speaking about the relation between geopolitics and the internal dynamics in the countries. So I was wondering, actually, I think also the way in which, it's not fair to refer to geopolitics as a simply way to simplify, you know? So I was thinking that it appears to us very easy to simplify reading a country through geopolitics. But I was wondering if you think that it's not like a way just to simplify, but it's a relevant political choice to explain Middle East through geopolitics and not through internal dynamics. So I was also wondering, for example, do you think it's so hard for us to try to simplify in a way that to make it readable our articles, speaking also about internal dynamics, because sometimes I think that also in academia we are very fun of taking the analysis very in a realistic way. So thinking about countries as a black box that we cannot read inside. But I see it like more a political choice than a way to simplify. But maybe I'm wrong. So I just wanted your opinion about that.
Yeah, thank you, Federico. Indeed, it's a political choice from many actors. Political in a wider sense. I mean, first of all, let's assume I'm a so-called analyst, seated in a chair, far from the object of my analysis, far from the ground. The only tools that I have is to open an atlas and to see the positions of powers, try to read history books, to find variables, continuity, discontinuity patterns, and then to build my own analysis on something that I understood from afar. That's why many times it's a political choice, because I lack the ability to access the territory and to have prolonged stays in order to listen, to grasp to the local, let's say, complexity. It's a political choice, of course. It's a policy-making sometimes attitude of listening only to these oversimplified ways of telling the story, because it's not only easy to read, but it is also easy to digest and to transform into a sort of policy-making decision. Tomorrow, the Italian Prime Minister will come here. And if we read her declarations regarding forced migration in the Mediterranean, but even her predecessors' way of picturing the forced migration issues are focusing, for instance, on smuggling, the war on smugglers. Who studies and who experienced from, let's say, a scholar or research perspective, this phenomenon knows that the smuggler per se should not be the point exactly. Is a little piece of the puzzle, but the narrative is chosen because it is simply to use it in a policy making, in talking to audience, to collect consensus. Talking to nuances, Ronnie was saying, is much more difficult in social media, and politics nowadays is using social media in a wide way. So I don't have an answer But if you and other people could help us all together to find a way to tell nuances, to transform our knowledge of the complexity into something that could be politically used, that could be, I think, a great achievement. I'm still looking for an answer on that. And if you have, please share with us.
Please go ahead. And just if you could just introduce yourself and just your name and what you do.
Riyadh, came from Tripoli.
See Lorenzo, Tripoli, Jabal Lebanon.
I've met Lorenzo in Tripoli.
Oh,
But
you forced him to come.
my question is how would we map all the complexities in society yet avoid paralysis, like especially paralysis of political action, especially that it's not only a society of complexities but also of contradictions, sometimes of negation or antagonism. It's not only that we could always reach a compromise. How would we then, especially since I, let's say as a party who now understand the complexity or the perception of the other side, how would I avoid paralysis? Political paralysis, I mean. Thank you. Or
That's the core of the negotiation ability. When you have paralysis, it means that at least the two parties, the two poles of the dynamic, weren't able to meet in between or to activate some sort of tool that could make them outside the paralysis. But the paralysis itself, as you described, could be also tactically achieved by parties in order to, or one of them, to exert pressures. In Tripoli, the paralysis of the socio-economic development could be seen as a political tool in order to push the Tripoli society into the corner and push them towards two choices: radicalism or forced migration. And then you have clearly the narrative that Tripoli is the realm of political Sunni Islam or the hub of poverty and so on, desperate situations. So paralysis is not only the result of the inability of two parties to negotiate, but could be also be activated on purpose. But again, what does, in this example of Tripoli, what do the society in Tripoli, with all its variety, how is reacting to this paralysis? How they are trying to go out of this trap and mobilize with many tools, trying to counter and to exit this corner. That's a question that is still open. How apparently passive segments of society can say no to the paralysis, can activate other forms of socioeconomic developments. If we look at the Tripoli society, again, we are it's a small laboratory on how Lebanon functions. Society divided as silos vertically from top to the ground. And for you as a citizen, aspiring to be a citizen, so to establish horizontal connections among your peers, it is very hard. You should be, perhaps, you can do something very fancy, very intellectual, to belong to circles that are really outside of the power system in order to be alive, to feel very close to someone that is part of the vertical dimension. But in practice, you are not able to go up and to establish something that is challenging the order. So I would have a recipe. I don't. But we need to investigate how societies at corner, paralyzed by other actors, can find a way to go out of this situation. Tripoli is a very good example on that. But I didn't answer, I know. But you raised a very crucial topic.
Are there other questions? The gentleman in back.
Thank you.
If you could just introduce yourself a bit, that would be great.
I'm from Italy as well. Closer. I'm from Italy as well, and I'm Luca. I've been living in here in 2022 for 1 year, studying in USG, and then coming back here to work this year. And I perceived throughout the full speech a certain tendency, at least in certain points, through Fanta politics, saying, okay, just imagine what could have happened in Lebanon or Syria, thinking about sectarianism, how it developed, how it affected nation building, state building somehow. And I've been wondering also about the causes rooted in this, dynamics in both nations. And Lorenzo touched a very interesting point, in my opinion, that was the matter of narratives. So Syrian nation building could have counted on many and way larger means to build a deeper and more horizontal way of create a state. And I see it in the first years in the 20th century, Shukanisma, Meiziade or Kawakibi or Al-Kurd. So I say how the two nations managed to cope with sectarianism in very different way, because both of them, they had all the elements to split like Lebanon did in the last few years. So I was wondering and also asking Lorenzo if it's only a matter of narratives that allowed the two nations to develop in such different ways somehow, or maybe it's also the way I'm thinking and conceiving the issue related to the fact that I just read Ghassan Kanafani lectures about the Great Arab Revolts in 36 and 39, giving great centrality to capitalism, and say, okay, maybe we should give back to capitalism a certain degree of centrality in analyzing the two country developments respect to Lebanon and Syria. Making an example. So basically, Syria resisted very in a higher way to this centrifuge, pushes in building something more unite. And maybe there's a certain role that must be given to capitalism, to French capitalism, in splitting and dividing, the front in Lebanon somehow. So I'm thinking about silk, the silk commerce in the 19th century. So basically, would you agree in saying that all these centrifuge pushes in Lebanon, making a comparison with Syria in distracting the idea of a central state, of a unity, was due also to capitalism? What's your opinion related to this?
Thank you, Luca. Thank you. I don't know if you want to react to the Fanta politic issue, and then I can go directly to.
No, I'll let you best answer this, but I'll only add that whenever I do go back in time and look at the way visiting dignitaries express Lebanon in history, there's two words I hear here all the time, not necessarily Syria. The Lebanese love their confessionalism and they love their capitalism. And I've seen those in different ways from the 50s, from the 40s going back. So that kind of, it's an overly simplification of the story, but that sectarianism and open markets here seem to transcend all types of political instability. But I'll let you better answer Luca's question.
I'll try. First of all, there was no Syria and there was no Lebanon before the French Mandate. So we should not assume that Syria was an entity that already existed, and so it escaped a centrifuge, if I well understood, dynamic that happened in Lebanon. There were many political entities, territorial political entities, both in newly created Lebanon and the newly created Syria. And the fact that Syria and Lebanon are described under the lenses of capitalism for Lebanon and socialism, let's use this Arab socialism in Syria, again, it is a product of the history, and it is a definition that could be put after and not before. Capitalism is very strong and still is in Syria too. We should not forget that the history of this country, of Syria, could not only resume in the last 100 years. When you measure and when you analyze the attitude of Damascus and Aleppo, the main economic hub for centuries, these seeds are still there, and they are very capitalistic way of thinking. Even though after 2011 they had to escape and to reopen and to try to establish businesses abroad, but Syria and capitalism are very connected. Perhaps capitalism before capitalism, in a sense, if we try to relativize this Western concept. Also socialism, the way socialism was applied and conceived and used practically and narratively has its own historical dynamics, more recent than the capitalistic one. So let's not forget that Lebanon, out of Mount Lebanon, was a political creation in order to serve, at that time, colonial purposes. You mentioned the silk industry that at the time was overexploited in order to serve the needs of European and Northern European markets. And many damages were done to the agriculture and to the society of Mount Lebanon in a few decades of time before World War I because of this overexploitation from a foreign capitalistic attitude. Lebanon was created in order to have a bridge and harbor and to easily sell goods and markets to the depth of the new Syrian territory. The telegraph, the first fluvial trade commerce along Deir ez-Zor are very recent, the second half of 19th century. They were all the telecommunication. Nowadays we are talking about smarts, but the telegraph at the time altered the status, the power status at local level. All these technologies and political weapons were used in order to penetrate a territory from a colonial point of view in different shapes, because you need to adapt to the context you are dealing with. In Deir ez-Zor, you need to negotiate with the local elites in a way, in Damascus in another way, in Beirut in another way. But your colonial project is still ongoing on until the Euphrates River, Baghdad and Mosul, of course, were part of this wave. So, socioeconomic is one factor. Politics, in its specific sense, is another factor. Sectarianism. Again, sectarianism. We can just quote a book that could still rise a debate. Osama Makdisi. Oh. Yeah, but I know that is one of the most perhaps debated scholarly book on, but is analyzing.
And that's that's the more recent book, I think. It's from about the 1800s. I forgot the name of the book.
The Culture of Sectarianism.
That's it.
In 2000. It was written 24 years ago.
Yes, about the 19th century.
19th century. I was not referring to the new one.
Yeah.
Anyway, how Osama Maktisi, the methodology of Osama Maktisi is an historiographer, Lebanese, but Palestinian, Lebanese.
Palestinian, Lebanese, American. I think he's in Texas.
Yeah.
How
he dismantled the narrative of sectarianism, seen only from an outside perspective, and focusing on the inner dynamics in Mount Lebanon. That could be enlightening in terms of how we should look from a methodological point of view in order to understand better how things happened. It was a negotiations among, first of all, not only the Ottoman, the colonial powers, and the local elites, but even between the local elites and at the time, let's say, the rural classes or the impoverished lower classes, there was a very interesting and dynamic of trying to alter the balance before the Tanzimat took the floor and altered in a sectarian way the Mount Lebanon ecosystem. I know that I'm going through technical stuff, but again, also the question prompted me to be a little bit more technical on this. I don't know if Luca answered your questions. We should sit perhaps and drink more than 2 coffees. I don't know if I was clear enough.
It's a rich question and it's a very difficult answer, but
again, the history has a weight. We should really look at history not in a bad or in a good way, but we cannot deny its present force.
I remember reading his work more in focusing exclusively on external factors. I don't know if maybe it's not the same text. Perhaps. It could be his more recent one.
Perhaps, yes.
Where AUB is problematic. I think that's his more recent book.
Okay.
And his brother lectures at AUB.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe he doesn't. Are there other questions? Any of the journalists in the room want to ask Lorenzo any questions? No? No more questions. Is that a hand in the back? Oh, no, that's just a scarf. Yes, sir. Gentleman in the middle.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lorenzo, for your enriching presentation. Actually, I would like to make a very specific question about you. During your presentation, you discuss a lot about the issue of the central powers and peripheries, and between local authorities and central ones, and especially in the case of Syria. Recently, in the last years, there was a kind of substitution of some local authorities. You mentioned the case of the Mahlouf family, and it's clear that nowadays he was kind of he was removed from the central, from the core of the Syrian regime. But at the same time, there are some analysis about local warlords which are thriving and exploiting the situation of a war-torn country, which is Syria today. Could you please elaborate a little bit more about this phenomenon and which should be the relations between those warlords with the Assad family, and what's the future of this dynamics? Could you please delve a little bit more on this point? Thank you very much. My name is Felipe. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. Again, back to the approach of trying to put at the center dynamics, interactions between individuals at intermediary levels. Behind the fact who's in charge in Damascus, Bashar al-Assad is in charge officially in Damascus. We have a so-called dominant actor and apparently subaltern actor. If you look at the national scale, we can use the example of one prominent intermediary, Wasit, in Raqqa, using his traditional family channels vis-a-vis Damascus in order to shape his power in Raqqa. Bashar al-Assad, through other intermediaries, is tightly connected and continuously negotiating with the Raqqa local elites in order to be sure that Damascus authority, even though from a military and political perspective is not anymore there, reaches Raqqa in a way, doesn't abandon Raqqa and its environment through many compromises, many exchanges among these two figures. Of course, always between these two poles, there are many connectors. They are not interacting directly. This guy in Raqqa can also lose his power, can be killed, could be eliminated politically. Central power, even if it's not anymore there physically, needs to replace or to find another channel in order to negotiate with the local community in that city. Many times they find more, let's say, weaker intermediaries that could later on be stronger in order to be able to channel Damascus voices in a specific community. It's a matter of access, first of all. When you miss, when by many chances, like the Makhlouf issues, you have to eliminate one chain of the machine, you have to replace it with another one that more or less could manage the same tools that you need, the same functions that you need to activate there. You should always be able to have someone in a place that could answer the phone and behave in a way that could be manageable by you. So we are talking about paralysis. Paralysis or inability to act, to mobilize yourself is when you don't have access, when you don't have someone who can answer the phone when you call. Diplomats know very well this, the need to be always connected and networking everywhere. Because if you lose access, you lose power. So Damascus, through the institution, and Ronnie was asking me the power of the institutions. The institution per se are empty shells, but the shells should be there. The Ministry of the Health, the Directorate of the Health in Hasakeh should be there, always with the doors open, with the electricity functioning, because the salaries of the small governmental hospital in Hasakeh should be always functioning. And this tool gives me access from Damascus, gives me a little bit of power in order to negotiate and to always be there to say, yes, you can arrange a partition situation here in Hasakeh. You can decide to exploit their local resources and the distribution services in this way. But I have someone that represents me here, the Directorate of the Health, and so I can count, and my voice is still present. Damascus central government was and still very good to be granularly present, even if it's not present at all from a military point of view. The Daraa example in south, close to the Jordan border, it's a very clear example. For 5 years, the Syrian government was not politically, institutionally present in Daraa. After, because of the Russians, they went back in Daraa, capital of the governorate. In few months, they were able to reestablish the entire institutions. The institutions were always there. Empty shells, occupied by other elements. But once you maintain the access and the presence, even minimal presence, you are able to reactivate and to give colors, to put play on your recorder, and then the flag of the Syrian government again was showed on the Damascus, on the Daraa municipality. That was a very expression of power. 5 years of vacuum, you are able to reestablish the order in few months in a context of prolonged conflict and financial collapse. That is not an easy task. I don't know if I answered your question. I tried not to give so many names, not to use the always famous Katerji example, but many of them. So it's a full of intermediaries, full of people who have interest in being in between, in the gray zones. That's the power of the system. That's why the system is still there.
Maybe we have time for one more question. Yes, the lady in the middle. And just who you are. And
Yes,
yes.
thank you. Hello, I'm Italian as well. I'm Agnese. I'm a freelance journalist. I live here. And I just wanted to ask you, like, going back to Lebanon, I was wondering, just taking from what you just said, is there such a thing as dominant power and subaltern one in the Lebanese landscape, and how those forces interact, especially in some sectors of the society? I don't know, for example, the defense system. Is there such a thing?
Could I answer a bit? Steal the mic just for a few seconds?
Please.
We may not see eye to eye on this, which would be nice. We could also offer maybe parallel answers. We'll see if it matches up. I think nuance is the goal, and I share the mission in that the gray zone, if you will, the gray space is really where the story is. But I think in this country's tragedy, any reference to something like defense, I think, has become so meaningless, unfortunately. I think there is a coalescing of power that is probably more geopolitical today than ever in Lebanese history. I can't imagine it being described any other way. So, for example, what happened this morning or early this afternoon in the south, the Lebanese state, the defense ministry, plays absolutely no role in separating villagers from militiamen. The state is simply not playing a role today. That is, I think, fact. What the state does and the institutions do today, I think, best reflect that power dynamic, which is protect. Now, protection goes back to, I can't remember which month it was, in Kahali in the mountains, the Damascus Road, the army intervenes to de-escalate what could be an explosive situation, like today. Except villagers see a truck full of weapons, and there's a shootout. The state there does not do anything to rein in the occupants of the truck, or for that matter, the weapons are temporarily shelved and then handed back to Hezbollah. That's the defense ministry at the moment, playing a very profound pandering role to a proxy militia. Now, that's how I see the geopolitical reality at play. Within that, you have a lot of intrinsic support, I think, for a sectarian system that has survived the 20th century and a quarter of the 21st century. And actually, this was going back to something I wanted to ask you during the episode, and maybe I can plug it now. I tend to think these words become more meaningless over time. Sectarian or secular, consociational, power sharing, whatever. I think there is a built-in inertia to actually keep things as they are, as they evolved from Ottoman history through French Mandate into the 21st century. Which means probably over time that the geopolitics can command the most important aspects of the story. But when it comes to the superficial, that's still sectarianism as we understand it. And I think that has more or less survived intact. So it's a superficial answer, maybe. I'll let you better answer that than me.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you for the question. When you mean the defense, as Ronnie was referring to, you mean the institution of the states, or you mean something that could be also outside of the states? Because both of them.
Both? Is that? Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, a few days ago, I was just thinking about the tricky word defense using for legitimate, in many countries, the monopoly of violence. In many countries, there is an offensive army that is called defense. Not only Sahel, not only the Israeli army, the Israeli defend not only the Kurdish militias in Syria are also these, but even in Italy and in many other countries. I would like just to raise an alert in how we use this defense narrative in the proper way or not. Of course, under circumstances of open war with another entity like Israel, we can honestly talk about who's defending Lebanon nowadays. Fine.
Good luck, Lorenzo.
Again, timeline, chronology. When Israel started its first invasion in 1978 in South Lebanon, who was defending Lebanon at the time? When the Palestinian armed groups fled from Jordan and northern Galilee in Palestine to Lebanon in the late 60s, before the Cairo Agreement, 69, who was defending Lebanon? In the 78, 82, 85, different waves of unauthorized military presence, because when we can also raise the issue of, but the Syrian army entered too and militarily occupied. Yeah, but at the time, like the Russia in Syria, are playing this tricky role of the narrative. Yeah, but the Damascus government asked the Russian protection. The Beirut government at the time asked the Arab League umbrella, and then the Syrian came out. So we should also distinguish, because institutions can play a role, and when you put on the forefront a formal demand of a government to a foreign army to enter into a country, it could be framed, at least from a formal point of view, in a different point of view. But again, we can, let's say, after this, we can also remember who was defending Lebanon in 1976. So there are many waves of foreign military presence and offensive acts in Lebanon, and the question is still there. Since when the state of Lebanon took the challenge, took the mission of defending the entire sovereignty of the country? It's an open question. Please help me in finding an exact date when Lebanese aviation, thank you. Now I'm tired.
Aviation,
yeah, the Air Force.
Yes.
I'm still looking at when the Lebanese had their own air forces effectively. So I don't think I think it's a political decision since mostly the beginning of this, the existence of this country, not to have a defense. So we should contextualize nowadays situation into this continuity pattern. So it's a political decision that this Ministry of Defense, I don't know the name even, I forgot, is playing this role of doing anything. But we are not in Italy or in a European country. We are in Lebanon that is accustomed, unfortunately, to this kind of vacuum. And I'm not agreeing I'm not happy for that. I would like to be.
I had an episode dedicated to the question itself. So you may know him, Nadim Shhadi. He used to be at Chatham House and Oxford. Now he writes for Arab News. He's an Ottoman in 2024. He believes in Ottoman cosmopolitanism. That's his lens. It seems over time that there's only one example of close to what you're referring to is 1967, where every state neighboring Israel loses geography and defeat. In Lebanon, there's not one shot fired on either side of the border. So that's close, I think, to what you're alluding at, which is it's not the Lebanese army that is stopping the Israeli army. No. But there is what looks like less geopolitical intrusion into a fledgling, what could be a sovereign state over time, not one entirely at that point. That, I think, is the only example. In other words, the most famous war that shapes Arab-Israeli history post-1948, Lebanon's entirely spared, which I think is actually a remarkable achievement. But you're absolutely right. It's not the Lebanese Air Force that is intimidating anyone. I think it probably best reflects that regional play, which is Lebanon is not seen as a battlefield, therefore Lebanon doesn't need to be the battlefield, doesn't have to play a role. Hence, no one is really shooting here yet. But that's 2 years before the Cairo Agreement. So it's months before the whole story of neutrality, let's say, before that ends. Thanks to you. No, on the contrary. Did we answer that question? I hope so. Guys, one more question, and then we can wrap it up. Anyone? Samir, the other audio technician, usually has like... No one? No? Okay, I'll ask the final question. All right, I'm gonna bring it home, make it personal, because this is a personal journey for you. You mentioned at the beginning, this is your neighborhood, this is your street. You come here in your 20s, or so, late 20s.
Late 20s.
Your late 20s, you're on a Vespa here, you're finding your career taking off. 20 years later, you're speaking to us about your career and more. I think that's a remarkable journey. I'll keep it very easy. What this story, in terms of covering this part of the world, the good and the bad, as it impacted you. Not the divorce. Don't get divorced again, because I think you're going to end up marrying somebody from Iraq, right? You move east every time. And then the fourth one, Iran, and then you come back and... No. Proxy marriage. No. The maybe what impressed upon you in both ways. The positive of having this career here and the negative.
No, there is no negative.
No negative.
No negative. I am what I am because of all the all the choices that I did in this city mainly. And sometimes, yeah, okay. I didn't want, when I was young, I wanted to be a journalist, but I didn't want to marry at all. I didn't want to have any family. Now I have 3 kids. So I made many things that were not really planned in my life. Okay. So I learned that we should always be humble with our projects and plans, because everything can be very far from that. I don't see myself but how I am through this journey. I cannot imagine studying Swedish and understanding complexity in Stockholm. I would perhaps sometimes I really wanted to live in Stockholm and to deal with the Swedish complexities, or in Finland, something very far from here. But then I'm always back here. Nobody now is asking me to come here forcefully, and I'm coming as much as I can for pleasure, for an inner pleasure, not for having a drink in Torino. That's a part, but the journey still goes on.
That is the most nuanced answer I could imagine. You made it happen. So the book is Negotiation and Power in the Middle East, The Roots of Conflict in Syria and the Region. English edition comes out next year. The Italian edition came out last year. Sandwiched in the middle, you're here. Thank you, Lorenzo.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for listening and watching. And a friendly reminder to support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box. Until next time, I'm Rani Shattah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.